Can you hear me? Okay. So let me introduce this panel today. We're gonna touch upon international trade and globalization. So I would like to ask my panelists, Professor Evenett, Professor Crabtree, and Professor Towson, to quickly introduce themselves and share their views on this very important topic today.
So thank you, Pietro. I believe I should go first. So my name is Simon Evenett. I'm a Brit, but I actually live and work in Switzerland. I teach at a Swiss university, which is in fact the business school for the German-speaking world. We have strong ties to Thailand and to East Asia in general, our university, and it's a great pleasure to engage through this webinar with you. Let me get to the substance. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of where the world trading system is going. I'm going to make essentially 5 very short points. The first is that what we're seeing now is almost certainly the biggest shock to the world trading system since its modern creation in 1947. We are seeing falls in world trade volumes, which are extraordinary. To give you some backdrop here, the peak to trough fall in world trade volumes during the global economic crisis 10 years ago was 20%, and it took 10 months. We have already seen, according to the latest data published this week, in just 4 months, our world trade has fallen 16.2%. So we've gone 80% of the way that we went during the last crisis in much less time. If you look at the emerging markets, excluding China, world trade volumes are 10.5% below their peaks. And that peak was 6 months ago. So there's still a profound reduction there too. So overall, we are seeing a big contraction in trade, and this is expected to continue. The second point I want to make is that there have been three facets to government policy response, which I want to highlight. The first is in the area of medical goods and medicines. And here we have seen an incredible rush for what few supplies are, or what appears to be, as often characterized as limited supplies that are available. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the fact that 90 countries have put in place around 177 different export curbs since the beginning of the year on medical goods and medicines. What is often overlooked is that 106 countries have liberalized their imports of medicines and medical goods. So governments realized it's pretty stupid taxing the imports of things like soap and medicines at times like this. And we've seen 196 reforms over the our last few months. So we have the first policy responses in the area of medical goods and medicines trade. The second policy response has been a massive resort to subsidies in order to support firms. And these are being done largely for broadly macroeconomic reasons. But the problem is with subsidies is that one government's economic support measures is another government's trade distortion. And the European Union, for example, has already authorized its member states and the UK to issue 1.95 trillion euros of subsidies. And some of those subsidies are being used for dubious reasons. The best example comes from Lufthansa, reported in the Financial Times. Its CEO stated, the German government was focused on how Lufthansa can maintain its position as a German global champion, not just how it could avoid insolvency. So in other words, the subsidy imperative is being potentially misused. The third response that you're hearing is some governments want to reconfigure supply chains to limit what they perceive as overdependence on China. Now, I should say here that the evidence base to support such propositions is extremely thin. The proponents of these ideas are not very specific about what they want to do, and there's a reason for that. The moment they know they will be attacked. And instead, what we seem to be having is policy making by herd instinct or herd mentality, rather than looking at the underlying evidence and facts and trying to figure out where these supply chains have gone wrong and asking yourself the hard question, does the private sector have strong incentives to fix that problem, which it probably does. So that's point number four. Point number four. My last point I will close with is the following, which is that as we're thinking about how governments respond to COVID-19, I think we need to think in the following terms. COVID-19 is almost certainly going to lead, for better or for worse, to bigger states and more state intervention. The international trade question is, to what extent does that policy intervention need to discriminate between foreign and domestic commercial interests? Can it be designed in a way that attains the public policy goals without engaging in protectionism? And if there is going to be discrimination, can it be limited? That is the $64 million question facing trade policy analysts in the world trading system, and it's being systematically avoided by many policymakers. And that's a real pity, and it's likely to lead to a lot of bad policy being put in place, and it will take us years to unwind that bad policy. And as a result, growth, resource allocation, and corporate performance will be retarded during that period of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I will pass on with Professor Crabtree. We will focus a little bit more on regional trade and emerging trends in Asia and Southeast Asia, and also the tensions between a global superpower.
Very good. Thank you, Pietro. Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everyone. So I join you here in Singapore. My name is James Crabtree. I'm an associate professor in practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here in Singapore, where I follow the kind of events that we're talking about today. So I will echo some of the points that Simon made and make 3 or 4 points to try and kick us off. One of which is, to begin, and to echo Simon, the trade outlook in this part of the world as globally is clearly dreadful. You've seen unprecedented declines in trade volumes. Initially, Asia was hit hardest. I suppose the slightly rosy outlook, or not rosy outlook, but the sliver of optimism is that China's output in terms of exports has now recovered. And so I think Asia will lead a kind of stumbling trade recovery. On the supply side, what's unusual about this crisis is that you're being hit both on the supply side and the demand side at once. And so I think you've seen some signs that supply is going to recover, and also that, in a sense, the global trading system, which gets such a bad rap at the moment, has responded reasonably well in the crisis. I mean, except in the very early days, you haven't seen much in the way of shortages, and to the extent that you saw shortages in areas like medical equipment, the system responded to them reasonably quickly. You haven't seen car factories having to close, for instance. It's proved that this system, which is apparently so problematic, has been quite adaptable. But of course, the longer term problem is one of demand. As happened after the global financial crisis, the real reason why trade falls off a cliff is because demand in the countries that buy things disintegrates. And so the sorts of things that are traded internationally, like cars and washing machines and consumer goods, these are the sorts of things that people stop buying when their economies are in crunching recessions. And so that means that the outlook for Asia's trading economies are still not great, even if they can get back on their feet from a supply point of view. There's a hanging question about when and under what circumstances people are going to want to start buying the kind of things that are producing. Point 2 is about protectionism. As Simon mentioned, there has been a kind of mixed picture on protectionism, but I think it's quite hard to imagine circumstances in which there aren't going to be an upsurge in protectionist sentiment in the aftermath of the crisis. So you've seen some measures with medical equipment, you've seen some measures with food, but in general, we're entering an international environment in which trade policy and geopolitics are becoming increasingly entangled. Just look at what's happened between China and India over the last 2 or 3 weeks, in which in a sense, because India can't respond to China for its Himalayan incursions militarily, or it's very difficult to do so, India has been moving down a path of increasing protectionism. And one of the downsides of the US-China trade war is it's very difficult to keep, in a sense, the use of these trade measures for geopolitical ends within circumscribed bounds. If two countries are doing it, or in this case the US is doing it, everyone else starts doing it as well. And so given the economic pressures that are going to come out of the COVID-19 era, and in particular because the international coordinating institutions that after the financial crisis in 2008 were reasonably good at trying to create a framework to stop a slide into protectionism are not working very well now. The WTO is in crisis. The G20 has been largely absent without leave. That means it's harder to imagine, in a sense, people of goodwill coming together to stop a rise in protectionist measures. So that's the second point. All of that points to a big picture trend, which has been widely pointed about, which is that we are entering an era in which the advances in globalization, for good or ill, that we saw for the 2 or 3 decades prior to the financial crisis, and which have been on pause thereafter, I think are going to begin to go into decline. This was, in a sense, true before COVID, but is being accelerated by it. But this is not exclusively a story about COVID-19. There are plenty of other things going on in the world, from changes in technology, which Simon's co-author Richard Baldwin has talked about, to changes in labor costs, simply to China's changing role in the global economy, which are making what the trade economists call global value chains, putting these under pressure, these international trade linkages. And that's even before we begin to consider the new era of geopolitical tensions that we see with the US and China. And so I think it's almost inevitable that there will be some degree of decoupling of the West and China. But as Simon says, once you begin to dig into this, it becomes rather problematic. So I think it's quite unlikely that large Western companies are going to voluntarily decide to leave the Chinese market or to stop production in China's market. China remains a hugely important growth market for companies from Apple to Volkswagen. It remains the easiest and most efficient place to do international contract manufacturing. That position is going to be strengthened by the COVID crisis, because China has come out of this crisis more quickly and stronger than any other country. And so if you want to start making ventilators, you want to start making masks, China remains overwhelmingly the best place to do it. So I think in a sense there hasn't really been a reckoning, as Simon says, in the West. Those who really want to push an agenda of decoupling have neither figured out how they're going to do this, nor have begun to be honest about what the costs would be in terms of lower growth, lower productivity. What does this mean for Asia? My final point, and I think you'll see a kind of three-way split in Asia, and this is a reasonably obvious point, which is East Asia has come out of this crisis reasonably well. China has handled it with technocratic competence, except in the initial stages, and the real kind of gold star nations, Taiwan, South Korea, to some degree Japan, to some degree places like Singapore, also Thailand has done very well, as has Malaysia. But East Asia has done particularly well. And I think one of the big trends that comes out of this crisis is the continued rise of East Asia as, in a sense, a leader in the global economy. Southeast Asia sits in the middle of that, but I think the real divide is going to be between, in a sense, the upper middle income economies of the region and the emerging markets, that in general, for all sorts of reasons that we can go into, this is a terrible time to be an emerging market. Emerging markets, particularly the poorer ones, like Indonesia and India, are having the worst time with the pandemic, and show the least signs of having the kind of state infrastructure spending capacity to both cushion the blow of the crisis and manage their way out of it in the way that a country like Taiwan or Singapore or New Zealand or Australia has managed to do. And so I think you'll see a greater divide in Asia opening up between South Asia, where I used to live. I lived in India for quite a long time and have written about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, these countries. To some degree, I'd bracket Indonesia in that group. They're the ones who are going to be most affected by this and stare down the barrel of a lost decade. The more advanced economies, I think, have a good shot of rebounding from this and emerging, if not absolutely stronger, then at least relatively stronger. And I'll end my remarks there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. So you mentioned about emerging technology trends that are in a way reshaping the landscape of international trade and globalization. And so I will pass on with Professor Towson from Beijing University, and I will ask him to give an introduction on the topic of digitalization of Asia.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate being here. I'm in Bangkok, where I have been trapped for several months outside of China, which is my usual stomping ground. And I focus on digital China, digital Asia. So that's overwhelmingly a micro question. That is company-specific analysis as opposed to macro or even trade. So I'm going to sort of talk at the granular level here. And I really just make sort of 2 points as relates to digital China, digital Asia, which are increasingly becoming one question. For a long time, it was digital China. It's really becoming an Asia story. Most of what we're seeing in China, we're now seeing in Singapore, Malaysia, even the Philippines, Thailand, places like that, more and more and more. But as it relates to trade, I think there's sort of two things that I'm keeping my eye on. The first is what I would call the internationalization of the platform business models of China. Or you could call this the digitization and the democratization of trade, where we are well accustomed to Chinese companies going global, made in China, the factory of the world. You go to Mexico, you go to Brazil, you go to India, you're going to see Chinese smartphones, 70, 80% of the market. We're very well accustomed to the idea of companies in China, Asia, make products and sell them to the world. There's a certain class of company, like an Alibaba, a JD, a Tencent, that is also going international, but they are not in the product business. They are in the connection business. What Alibaba does for a living is to connect things. And these, so they call them platform business models, ecosystem orchestrators, network-focused business models, a lot of terms for the same things, but they are in the business of connecting things. And these companies are increasingly going international as well, and that's kind of impacting trade in an interesting way. So Alibaba.com, their B2B business, not their B2C business, but they're connecting small and medium enterprises in the United States or Japan with Chinese manufacturers, which was their first business back in 1999. They have increasingly been going abroad and going international over the last couple years. And really, they've made some big announcements in the last month or so about we are going to help SMEs all over the world interact and connect with each other the same way that only multinationals have been able to do previously. So they're kind of making SMEs act like MNCs. So for example, a small 2 to 3 person company in Texas could go on Alibaba.com today. Maybe it's 2 people sitting in a warehouse and they're making tables to sell in the United States online. They can go to Alibaba.com, decide we want a new component for our manufacturing, pull out their cell phone, scan the item with the photo. It will then do visual search. It will connect them with 10 to 15 manufacturers in China. Could be Asia, could be the Philippines, could be Malaysia. Today it's mostly China. Find them 15 manufacturers. They can then do a virtual tour of the factory on their smartphone. They can do a conversation with those factory owners, auto-translate, immediate translate. I speak in English. The person on the other end hears Chinese. They speak in Chinese. I hear English. Can then order the product. Alibaba will handle the regulations It will handle the shipping. It will handle the ports, the customs. It will even offer financing such that they will offer me 60-day credit as a small company in Texas, so that I don't pay until after I get the item and I'm good within 3 to 5 days, 7 days. I verify it's okay, then the money is released. That's what they are offering in their platform, such as a way of connecting SMEs around the world. And if there's any problem, they will offer dispute resolution. That's a very interesting capability between an SME in the US and an SME in China. So that's when we talk about democratizing. First, we digitize trade, where it becomes a digitally enabled process that operates through a platform like Alibaba, and then it becomes democratized. It becomes something that big companies have always been able to do, but now little companies can do. US to China, maybe Philippines to China. Maybe I'm a US company based in Texas with 2 employees. I can now buy goods in China confidently, easily. I can turn around and sell those in Brazil on the same platform. That's what they're trying to build, a global platform. And they call this the EWTP, which Jack Ma was talking about forever before he stepped down from Alibaba in the last 6 months. That's a very interesting phenomenon that's happening right now, sort of below the surface. So that would be kind of point number 1. Watch out for these platform business models to increasingly connect the world and to dramatically expand what we consider to be global trade from what it has previously been to it's a game everybody can play. That's a big deal. It's moving forward right now in stops and starts based on regulation and ministries and whatnot. That's point number 2. Point number 2, which is my other point, also happening on the ground is this idea of cross-border e-commerce, which is not a sexy field. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but we are increasingly seeing companies or consumers like me in Thailand. I can access pretty much everything sold out of China through Lazada Global. There's a lot of cross-border trade between China and Russia happening right now, which is very interesting. There's a lot of trade cross-Asia that's happening on e-commerce, Philippines, Indonesia, a lot of stuff going on in Indonesia right now. There's a big announcement like Yiwu has just said we're going to do a whole lot of cross-border stuff out of Yiwu as of last week. So that sort of cross-border stuff is happening. Very interesting. It's mostly an Asia story right now. I would say keep your eye on that in 2 ways. 1, watch for that to expand beyond Asia, into Russia, into Eastern Europe, into the Ukraine, places like that. And then also look for this idea that cross-border e-commerce is increasingly becoming a social media business. So we see Facebook trying to move into e-commerce as fast as they can. We see ByteDance moving into e-commerce, TikTok, e-commerce, Kuaishou, e-commerce. All the social media companies are trying to move into e-commerce, and the e-commerce companies like Amazon, Alibaba are trying to move into social media. We're seeing a convergence of these 2 industries. That's going to play out in the e-commerce world, and we already see companies like Alibaba announcing we want 100,000 live streamers around the world to join our platform and start to talk about, hey, I'm a Polish live streamer based in Warsaw. Let me talk to you about these 5 products coming out of Malaysia and Singapore and China. So cross-border e-commerce is going to start to merge with influencer economy, social media. That's converging in a big way. Those are my sort of 2 things, and I think that takes me to about 6 minutes. So that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on in the trade aspect. It's all very cool, by the way. It's great fun.
So thank you very much for this insight on the digitalization of e-commerce and this integration of digital services into, like, let's say, more traditional e-commerce. So first of all, I would like to ask a little bit of provocative question. So, I mean, as you see in the poster of our webinar, we chose as a background picture a drawing that is representing the Opium War between the UK back then and China. So, and this, I mean, it's a question that I would like to ask all our panelists as to kickstart this session. So, do you see that COVID-19 and the current economic crisis can eventually create some like conflicts, let's say not just a sort of like Cold War between the United States and China, but let's say a real conflict in Asia, or, well, to be more specific, in South China Sea? Do you see that this could actually happen?
Let me have a crack at that one. I mean, I think it's perfectly possible. Accidents do happen. You have all sorts of patrols happening in areas like the South China Sea, and so it's perfectly possible that you could have boats bumping into each other. But I think under normal circumstances, the risk of that happening is reasonably small, and at least the US and Chinese militaries have fairly well worked out protocols for dealing with incidents like this. So I think it's not something that people are expecting. I mean, if you look at the real trouble spots, the East China Sea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the idea of an actual shooting war breaking out, I think, is something that most analysts do not see as being terribly likely in the short term. But what I think you are seeing in the aftermath of COVID-19 is a return to a more assertive Chinese foreign policy posture, which is similar to what happened after the financial crisis, which had consequences for trade and consequences for a whole range of different kind of international relations. I mean, this isn't a terribly original point, but it's not that difficult to see a pattern in the way that China is behaving in the South China Sea with Hong Kong vis-a-vis Taiwan, Japan, now most recently with India. And I think the way that that plays back into trade policy is it simply means that it's much more difficult to make economic policy in a way that is trade enhancing in two respects. Firstly, trade is being wound into political decision making in a way that simply wasn't true in this unusual period prior to the financial crisis, in which what we call the rules-based international order was in a sense an attempt to separate the rules of international economics and trade from geopolitics. That was the point of this. And that when people say that's breaking down, that's what it means. It means we have a recoupling, as it were, of people using trade policy for geopolitical ends. Equally, if the US and China are fighting, or not fighting, but if they're feeling grumpy with one another, then that means that international institutions work much less well, and so it's more difficult to craft the kind of international frameworks that are trade enhancing. So just look at what's happening with the World Trade Organization at the moment. You have a competition for who will be the next head of the organization, which is inevitably going to become a kind of fight between the US and China, which tends to happen with every international institution. Look at what happened in the aftermath of the early stages of COVID-19, when people were looking for advanced international cooperation, which didn't really happen because the US and China were at loggerheads. And so while I don't think it's terribly likely, we hope that there is going to be a rapid deterioration resulting in military tensions, then simply the fact that there are going to be ongoing tensions between the US and China, and also China and India, China and Japan, China and Korea, that is an environment that makes it more difficult to manage the international trading system and to bring in the kind of frameworks that can enhance trade.
Perhaps I could just add one very short point, is that I largely agree with what James has said. I think in general, COVID-19 and the pandemic is an aggravating factor in terms of commercial relations. It's certainly going to make things worse. We see that showing up in areas such as the screening of foreign direct investments, which have become a lot tighter in much of the Western world in the last 6 to 12 months. So that's on the negative side, and you can paint a picture there which could get worse. There's one wrinkle I would like to add, which is that for much of the last 5 or 10 years, many Western countries and Japan have criticized China for massive resort to subsidization and the consequences of that. I'll be interested to see how hard they're going to push those arguments, given how governments have behaved in the West over the last 6 months, pumping out lots of subsidies as well. So I think the subsidy discussion is going to have to evolve, or possibly even just be ignored. So ironically, COVID-19 may take off or may diminish one of the areas of overt disagreement, precisely because everyone is subsidizing and propping up their firms at the moment. So that's another aspect to watch as well.
Okay, so thank you very much for your insight on this topic. So let me move on to first question, which is more on like globalization for Professor Evenett. There is a theory on globalization by Richard Baldwin that breaks down globalization into 4 stages, and now we are entering into the 4th stage of globalization, with an increasing role played by the service sector, where we also see an increasing role of artificial intelligence. And so in globalization 4.0, there is actually an opportunity, but ever since, on the other hand, a threat, because for especially professionals that live in advanced economies, this is the very first time that they see the challenge of professionals from emerging world that can actually deliver the same type of work remotely. And I think that COVID-19 in a way accelerated this trend of remote working and so on. At the same time, AI-driven automation can also displace workers, also white-collar workers, in advanced economies. And we all know that the 3rd stage of globalization, 3.0, with the offshoring of manufacturing activities, is one of a deep root of this backlash against globalization in, for example, the United States, but also Europe. So my question is, how do you see that COVID-19 is accelerating this trend of further digitalization of services, and how this can actually change policies in advanced economies, especially in the United States and in Europe?
So I think the answer in a nutshell is that COVID-19 and the pandemic actually reinforces the arguments that Richard Baldwin has made about how we can now organize services in a cross-border manner, and will therefore increase competition for labor across the world. Let me just quickly explain. Up until now, until the pandemic, it was often thought that there may be more cross-border delivery of services, but there was still value in people meeting face-to-face, often in group work and in solution provision in this manner. I think the COVID-19 has really shocked assumptions about that, because like I'm sure I'm not alone, many of us have been on online conference calls and the like, where we've solved problems at large remote distances. So some of the saving grace is the hope that some parts of services activity would be would still remain or require proximity. That assumption has been challenged, or at least the range of services which require proximity is probably narrowed compared to what we thought 6 months to 12 months ago. If that is right, it strongly suggests that the degree of cross-border competition for this delivery of high-quality services by professionals will intensify faster than we thought. And what that will mean for your students is that they're not graduating into a Thai job market, they're graduating into a global job market. Now, let me just put a little bit of local spin on this. I teach in Switzerland here, where our master's students, when they graduate, are extremely well paid by international standards. They will increasingly have to justify those very high salary levels based on productivity their levels. They cannot just be carried along by the rising demand for labor generally within Switzerland. And this, I think, is going to have a big shakeup in some labor markets, in the West and in high wage nations. And this, I think, will then potentially have spillover effects for support for populism and as like. Once we have students who realize they've gone to university, they've got a piece of paper, they think they know a lot, they can't do very much, and therefore they can't justify the high salaries which they hope to have. And so I think this is a generation which is going to have to moderate its expectations in the high wage countries. For really smart, talented people in graduating in middle income countries and lower income countries, this is a huge opportunity to surge ahead and to expand their range of potential clients and customers. And all I would say to good luck to them. And I hope that they do well. And that as a source of inspiration and entrepreneurship is something we can all benefit from.
Thank you. So after having this overview on the stages of globalization, I think that would be nice to learn a little bit more about how globalization and international trade are focusing more and more on innovation. And so I have one question for Professor Towson related to the innovation landscape and environment in China, especially in the Pearl River Delta area, in Shanghai and in Beijing. So I would say that right now, analysts are aware of the strength of China in innovation. However, due to the rising tensions with the United States and also in light of the current pandemic, my question is how strong, how resilient is Chinese innovation system? And is the Chinese innovation system ready to compete against the American ecosystem? Because we see that this tension had also some impact on technology, on telecommunication industry. So my question is on the resilience of the ecosystem, the Chinese innovation ecosystem, and how this ecosystem can, let's say, survive the challenge against the United States.
It's funny when we talk about globalization, so much of it is about what you can measure. So people measure trade because you can measure it. They measure FDI because you can measure it. Mm. When I look at Asia, which is kind of my area, we can see products, we can see labor moving, we can see capital moving, but like the two that I'm probably most care about are data and expertise, which are increasingly moving throughout the region. We see a huge transfer of expertise from sort of, let's say, developed Asia, South Korea, Japan, parts of China, to the rest of Asia right now. That doesn't get picked up on any of these screens, but it's a huge thing happening. And within China, something that people never measure is just the pure amount of brain power that is there now. You go back to 1999, there were probably about 800,000, 900,000 college graduates per year in China. That's about 8 million now. So in the course of 5 to 10 years, we're going to see 80 million people come out with engineering degrees, civil engineering degrees, chemistry degrees. There is a massive sea of brain power in China right now that is jumping over into everything you can imagine. So I don't think that gets properly registered as the phenomenon it is. Mm-hmm. In terms of your question about innovation in China versus the rest of the world, I think it depends what sector you're talking about. If you're talking about hospitals, which is an area I think about a lot, no, you look at the US. The US has amazing healthcare in terms of technical capabilities. If you look at anything on a smartphone, it's going to be better in China than it is in the US now. I mean, look at all the innovations coming out in e-commerce, live streaming, the emergence with social media, new retail. I mean, Alibaba is so much better than Amazon. It's a joke. Social media is so much better than Facebook or Twitter. It's ridiculous at this point. So, I mean, the epicenter of pretty much innovation on a smartphone, mobile apps, it's Asia, China by far. It's mobile payments. I mean, just run down the list. So it really depends what sector you're talking about. Smart manufacturing, the emergence of manufactured products with digital. This is why everyone's smartphone is made in China now. smart scooters, smart cars. Well, that's a little different. So certain sectors, I think China, Asia is far ahead now. Other sectors, the U.S. is better. Fintech tends to be better in the U.S. in many ways. So it kind of depends on a lot of stuff.
So I see. Well, I see clearly your point that this analysis has to be done based on industries specifically. So, I mean, based on what we witness every day, it seems that the conflict between the trade conflict between the United States and China is shifting towards the semiconductor industry, where the United States still have a competitive advantage that not even Europe could actually catch up in this during the latest 20 years. So do you see that in this specific sector, which is, by the way, one of like the foundation for telecom industry as well, do you see that China can actually compete against the United States?
Right. I think semiconductors are a unique case. I mean, most of these businesses are global. The value chain for semiconductors, for everything, it's global. No country makes semiconductors. No country. I mean, it's a global value chain. But within semiconductors, the US does have a sort of position of strategic power, just as a artifact of how things have evolved. And for the first time, we have seen them try to use that control to exert extraterritorial control over what people can do. Keep in mind, the US basically just told TSMC not just what they can buy from them, but what they can do with their own products. I think that sort of assertion of extraterritorial control, which we've just seen happen, I think that's a bad idea. I think it's going to play out very badly for the US eventually. Not in the short term, pretty kind of a gangster move in the short term, bad move in the long term. But yeah, the semiconductor thing is an anomaly. Most value chains, there's multiple supply chains, there's multiple sources, and nobody can exert this type of control. So we'll see how long that lasts. I don't think it's going to last.
Thanks. So, well, I see that pretty much from all your observation, there is a very specific focus of the role of global value chain. And while some of you also pointed out that there is an effort to decoupling some value chains. And after the pandemic, some analysts and some policy makers emphasized that in case any other wave of COVID-19 is going to happen anytime soon, some specific industries like pharmaceutical industry, but it could be also like food and beverage, it should be in a way shortened. So like the value chain in this case should not be global, but should be regional or even a domestic or national value chain. So here I have a question that is, I would say, quite broad. So I mean, and I would like to hear your opinion, your perspective on this. So how do you see the value chain to be reshaped after COVID-19? Can we still talk about a global value chain, or value chain will become mostly regional value chains? So I think that probably Professor Evenett and Professor Crabtree can share their views on this point.
So I'll just make a few points here. I think it'll be very interesting watching what lessons the private sector draws from this experience, because they're going to move much faster than I think clumsy governments will move. And some of them, I think, may well decide they want to diversify sourcing. I would be very surprised if there is a widespread abandonment of international supply chains. I think the answer will be very significantly across sectors. In some sectors, the supply chains are very well entrenched. So the first thing I will watch very carefully the corporate responses to this, because I think they have the strongest incentive to get this right. The wild card is in public policy response. What type of harebrained, poorly thought through government responses are we going to get? Are they going to be extremely targeted and surgical, focusing in on one or two areas where there's real concerns about the need to have self-sufficiency or local or regional production? Or are we going to get sweeping measures which are going to limit access to markets either through procurement rules or huge amounts of carrots being offered as subsidies to repatriate production. I think that's the key thing to watch. So, the unsatisfactory answer is it is too soon to say, and I think the wild card is really whether or not governments will follow through on some of this rather sort of contagious rhetoric about overdependence on China and non-resilient supply chains.
Yeah, let me jump in on there. I mean, in a sense,
Thank you.
You had two forces at play in the period in which global value chains were created, in which you had these much more complex, long chains of production that stretched across different nations and around the world, one of which were policy changes that made the creation of these things easier, and one of which were technological. It seems likely that some of these policy changes are going to be reversed, but it's not entirely clear how. Technological changes aren't being reversed. So in a sense, the management tools that allow you to operate production in kind of complex settings are improving. And that's true, as we just talked about, for services as well as manufacturing. So it's not, in a sense, there's no clear picture as to what's going to happen. But as Simon says, there's a political move in the US and in Europe to both diversify sourcing arrangements to make them more resilient, and also to reduce an excessive reliance on China. Those two things are different, but they tend to get bundled together. Yep. For the question of resilience, so companies may decide in the short term that they do indeed need to make their supply chains more resilient, which means holding more inventory. But companies have very short memories. This was true, for instance, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2012, that they suddenly, all the companies found out that they were very reliant on particular parts that were made in particular parts of Japan. And then they said, well, never again, we better make our supply chains much more resilient. And then they forgot about it 5 years later, because it's much cheaper and more efficient to hold little inventory. And so there's a sort of hanging question, I think, about how short the memory of companies will be when trying to think about how they cope with something like a future pandemic risk. Are they actually going to change their behavior based upon what we hope remains an unlikely future scenario, although it may be that they decide that the risk of a pandemic is going to become a kind of normal course of doing business? The broader question about China, as I say, is a complicated one, because the companies that operate in China, given the choice, are unlikely to want to abandon China, either because they want to serve the Chinese market or because China remains a fantastic place to do manufacturing, as I said in my introduction. So you can move a little bit of your production to Vietnam or to Thailand or Malaysia, but if you've got substantial manufacturing production in China, you can't, or it's very difficult to move all of it there. The Chinese would be very angry with you and you'd lose your foothold in the Chinese market. And these countries tend not to have the same kind of capabilities as China. So as I said in my introduction, I think it is likely that over time, at the margin, manufacturing companies are going to seek other bases of production. But the idea that they're going to abandon China, I think at the moment is premature, unless, as Simon said, you suddenly get a really determined mixture of carrots and sticks. And a lot depends then on what we classify as these strategic industries. So when Emmanuel Macron said, in the aftermath of the pandemic, we must make ventilators in France. So we say ventilators are strategic, and then we say masks are maybe strategic. So what else is strategic? I mean, is pharmaceutical equipment, is that strategic? Pharmaceutical inputs? What about defense equipment? And so a lot depends, I think, on whether this political reaction in the aftermath of the crisis, which was trying to explain to people why there were shortages and why, in a sense, the governments were not able to protect their people, how far and how broad the sense of what counts as a strategic industry will go, and then how willing publics in the West and elsewhere are to bear goods that are potentially of higher cost and lower quality. So I think we're only in the beginning stages of trying to work that out, but I think it's a reasonable bet to think that many multinationals are going to begin to hedge their bets. They'll become slightly more regional in operation. They'll in the short term look for more resilient and more redundant ways of manufacturing, but that's a long way from the idea that you're going to have wholesale decoupling between Western markets and China.
Thank you. So I think we explored very interesting themes so far. So I have like a couple of questions, and then I think we can pick up some of the questions that our audience is asking right now on the YouTube channel of our school. So, I mean, I think we have a kind of like big picture on trends at international level, at Asia Pacific level. So I would like to ask James to introduce some of the upcoming trends in international trade at regional level in ASEAN. And especially we see that in ASEAN, even though it's an economic bloc, the growth rate for 2020 and 2021 are very diverse. So we see that, for example, Thailand most probably will go into a deep recession, but other countries such as Vietnam, such as Myanmar will keep growing. So how would you explain this? Is it only due to like the industries in each country or the different stage of development? Because like Malaysia and Thailand are more advanced compared to Vietnam and Myanmar, or do you see any other important trend that is impacting some Southeast Asian country more than others?
Okay, that's a great question. It's a difficult one to untangle. So ASEAN as a bloc has the obvious problem that it is so economically diverse. So you have Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia at the bottom, some of the poorest countries in Asia, right up to Singapore and Brunei at the top, some of the richest countries in the world. And so within ASEAN, we contain multitudes. And I think what you're seeing here is a range of different things going on at once. So Thailand's economic situation, despite the fact that it's done well in the pandemic, in a sense, is fundamentally bad because it's being hit by two very bad forces at once, one of which is a collapse in global trade and the other is a collapse in global tourism. And so if you have somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of your economy wrapped up in tourism and then a big chunk in export-focused manufacturing, it doesn't really matter how well you've done during the pandemic, and Thailand has done exceptionally well, your economy is going to take a big hit. Vietnam is doing well, I think, in a kind of contrary way, simply because it has done exceptionally well during the crisis. And its economy was growing quickly. Anyway, Myanmar is a bit more of a mystery exactly as to what's going on there. It was growing at a reasonably high rate before, and so the fact that it's still growing a little bit like a country like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka is probably because it started off with a high base, but still the contraction will be high. I mean, I think one of the more interesting things to think about with the role of ASEAN going forward is its relationship with China. What we mean by an increasingly regional form of globalization, I think, means that as China, to some degree, disentangles its economy from its relationships, or from some of its relationships in the Western markets, in Europe and North America for geopolitical reasons, then China's focus is going to be increasingly on Southeast Asia. So you see that in the area that Jeff knows about, the expansion of Chinese businesses abroad, where Chinese businesses don't tend to open in America or Europe. They are, in the first instance, when they go global, predominantly focusing on Southeast Asia. And so Southeast Asia is going to be drawn more firmly into China's economic orbit, which is part of a broader pattern that you see in China, I think, where in a sense you'll begin to see the real purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, although it was primarily seen to be about building infrastructure, was never really about that. It was about a new vision of Chinese-led globalization in which you had Chinese-led value chains, where instead of the end of the value chains being in America or Europe, you have value chains which are in a sense, flowing in and out of China and connecting China with emerging economies all around the world. And so I think Southeast Asia's role in that is interesting. And you see that in the political reaction to the crisis. So in many countries around the world, you've seen a pronounced upsurge in anti-Chinese feeling in the aftermath of the crisis. That's certainly true in North America, in Europe, and Japan, and latterly in India. I don't think you see that in Southeast Asia in the same way at all. In a sense, I think maybe in Southeast Asia, people have been reasonably admiring of the way that China has handled the crisis, and to some extent leaders in Southeast Asia recognize that they're so close to China and their economies are going to be so intertwined that in a sense they have to live with China, and the prospect of kind of talking about a world in which you begin to have an antagonistic relationship with China and decouple economically is not something that people see as a realistic future for this region. So I think that, in a sense, is the most interesting question coming out of the crisis. What is the changing relationship between ASEAN and China? And you already see that in the economic data. So for the first time in the first quarter of this year, ASEAN became China's most important trading partner. So China used to be the European Union by a long way, and then the United States, and gradually the US dropped down the list, and ASEAN came up, and now you see that China trades more with ASEAN than anywhere else. So that, I think, is what a future of regionally led globalization looks like on the ground.
Thanks, James. So I would like to connect with what you say. So you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. It is an infrastructural investment project by the Chinese government. So I have one very quick question for Jeffrey. So we have seen that the Chinese government, in light of a pandemic, in a way relabeled the Belt and Road Initiative and shifted the focus a bit from like an infrastructure investment project to be a health Belt and Road. So emphasizes on the role played by China worldwide by supplying medical equipment, masks, and so on to other countries that were facing the outbreak of COVID-19. So do you see possible in the near future that this Belt and Road will become a digital Belt and Road and will spread like Chinese tech champions like Alibaba or Tencent, WeChat, Weibo outside of China?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're talking about in terms of sector, but I mean, I think the future is overwhelmingly connected. I mean, we came from an age when everything was physical, products on ships, people getting onto planes, but so much of our life is digital now. And the nice thing about digital is everything's connected. So I think the future of Asia is just connected across the board. Now, what does that mean in practice? That means when you see an industry like gaming, you know, there's huge esports in Thailand, there's huge esports in Singapore and Malaysia and China, and it's all one thing now. You know, and now Tencent's a major player in that, but so is Sea Limited out of Singapore. And so we already see like this Asia connectivity thing in gaming, it's all the way. Now, as we move into retail, we're probably halfway there because it depends a lot more on the infrastructure being in place country by country. You have to have warehouses and delivery and things like that. But there is this idea that we are moving quickly towards a future where consumers will be connected in real time to smart logistics, to smart manufacturing in real time. The loop will close. So if Thai consumers want masks, that will be connected in real time to manufacturing in Thailand, manufacturing in China, manufacturing wherever, and logistics in the port. That will all just happen. And we can already see the final pieces of that loop being put into place in mainland China today. It's happening pretty much right now. I think that's very reasonable to think that medical products are eventually, it's going to be one closed loop between manufacturing, logistics, consumers, hospitals. That's going to be one thing within Asia. How far beyond that? I don't know. Communications were there, media were there, retail products were probably halfway there. The other one that maybe is halfway there today is payments and financial services. We do see companies like Alibaba have deals with, you know, Go Money and True Money and Philippines and Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Pakistan. They've got JVs everywhere now where if the regs can get done, we're going to see payments all across the region very, very quickly. So we can see we're moving that way. I'd put health probably about halfway, entertainment early mover, other stuff much slower. Yeah, I think that's reasonable to be assuming that's going to happen on the health space. Maybe not in services very quickly, but on the product side, probably. And
thanks, Jeffrey, for this.
All that requires infrastructure.
Yeah, please.
All of that requires a certain base level of infrastructure, which is logistics, regulation, payment, and some other things. So we'll have to see country by country how that opens up. That's sort of the bottleneck right now.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So I would like to choose some of the questions that our audience is asking live right now. So I think one that could be, I would say, perfect for Simon is a question on the role of international organizations, such as the WTO or the World Bank. And I would like to remind everyone that Professor Evenett was an officer with the World Bank as well. So after the challenge due to the trade war, do you think that COVID-19 will be a further factor that will stress international organization, especially in relation to international trade? And how would you see the future of the WTO in the next years?
So I think it's important to say that governments had already put the WTO and the international organizations work and trade in general onto the back burner. And again, I don't blame these organizations or their staffs. It's what governments have wanted from them. And they have not wanted to use these organizations either as a source of analysis, really, or as a place to do business in terms of liberalizing trade and or resolving disputes. That, I'm afraid, accelerates during a time of crisis. And or rather, those instincts are exacerbated because there are many governments who are not going to be particularly keen on having what their various subsidies and other actions made public. So I suspect cooperation will take a further hit, unfortunately. Now, if you want to tell a positive story, you go back to the global economic slump of the early 1980s, where there was a resort to one type of protectionism, which were limits on exports called voluntary export restraints. They happened a lot. At the time, the officials in Geneva collected lots of information on this, and then it became such a problem that governments were unable to deny it anymore, and these things were negotiated away in the Uruguay round, which concluded in 1993 and 94. So that's a positive story about how you go from crisis to better global economic governance. But when you go through the preconditions for that happening this time round, I just don't see them there. And that's, I think, a huge problem that we have. So to the extent that the international organizations in general will play a role, it's probably as a source of financing rather than as a source of ideas, and they're probably not as for international cooperation. And all of that is regrettable. I wish it were not the case, but if you ask me to predict, then I expect most action will be unilateral by governments. And we will deal with the fallout from that unilateralism for years to come.
Thank you, Simon. I have another question that I think could be interesting. So the audience is asking whether we are entering in a new stage of globalization after COVID-19 that is a sort of Chinese globalization. And this is like a comparison with the previous age that was, in a way, an American-driven globalization. So can we claim that after COVID-19, the major role in globalization is actually played by China rather than America or Europe? I think this could be like a question that maybe Jeffrey and James can answer.
I mean, I think it would be a reasonable way of thinking it is that the future model of globalization is going to be more influenced by China. I don't think it's going to be an entirely China. It's not as if the Chinese are going to replace the role that the United States and Europe have played in its entirety. So to repeat what I said before, I think what you will see is the creation of a kind of Belt and Roadosphere in which China builds stronger connections with the countries that are part of that kind of loose agglomeration of countries. But I think actually what's more likely is that you're going to see a fractured form of globalization in which you have different rules and standards that emerge across different blocks. So you have the world's three rule-setting giants, the United States, Europe, and China. And so one of the post-COVID, but in general, in an era of superpower competition and multilateralism, you're going to have more competition over international standards. So if you look at something like artificial intelligence or rules around electric vehicles would be two good examples. There's no clear global standard or set of global regulations emerging. What you have is a kind of competing set of different kinds of regulations. So if you look at privacy and data protection, that moves from the European framework, which is highly privacy protecting, to the Chinese framework, which has very few privacy protections built into it. And that comes with kind of costs and benefits on both sides. The same is true with the developing set of rules around 5G and the kind of equipment that can be used and why. And so I think you will see, in a sense, as China's economy grows and becomes a more important customer and supplier to the Belt and Road countries, as it were, China's most important partners, then China will play a greater role in shaping globalization and developing the institutions that shape globalization. But what that looks like for the rest of the world isn't China taking a dominant position as the United States used to have in the era of hyperglobalization. It means a set of competing standards, in some cases no standards at all, a fracturing of globalization that makes it more complicated for companies in particular to navigate.
What I think is really kind of fun to think about is we kind of know what China is. We understand I look at this at two levels: country, and company. We know what China is in terms of the regulatory system, the political system, the cultural aspects. It's pretty well known. And we know the major players, the companies. Fine. And in digital, which is my area. And if we say the US, we kind of know the same thing as well. But let's say we're talking about Southeast Asia. Well, then it's kind of unclear because we see both Chinese and US companies coming to Southeast Asia. If you're going to have a cloud service in Southeast Asia, it's going to be Amazon, Microsoft, Alibaba, Tencent, all competing. So the major companies are reflecting, coming out of the US and China, but they're going after these markets. So that's going to be very interesting to watch how those things play out. We know that Grab and Didi beat Uber, right? Done. We don't know what's going to happen with Amazon Web Services versus AliCloud. Okay, so we see the company competition in these other geographies is very interesting to watch. But then you also have to look at, within each country, the cultural and the political aspects, which are a big force in things like privacy versus security, content moderation versus censorship. There's a lot of very sensitive stuff going on about what India will accept from Amazon versus what India will accept from Alibaba. So we know the major powers, what they're doing. It's kind of the rest of the world that's sort of figuring it out country by country. And it's very interesting to see, how it's playing out country by country. I think it's really interesting. And I think people underestimate how much of this is cultural and political and not company versus company.
Thank you. So I would like to end this panel with a final question that I would like to ask all our panelists. And since we are running out of time, so we'll be like, let's say 1 minute each of you. So here in Asia Pacific, we see two threats, I would say, for most of economies in Asia Pacific. So one threat is the so-called middle income trap. It is a problem for China, for Thailand, and for many other Asian countries. And the other one is demographics, with aging population. And so here in Thailand, we are working to promote an innovation, innovation environment that can actually overcome this. So we emphasize on high value added industries, and we also try to develop healthcare innovation, healthcare technology to overcome the problem of aging society. So I would like to hear from you in relation to these two threats. So how could Asian economies overcome the threat of a aging society, aging population, and the so-called threat of middle income trap?
Maybe I can. No, so
Okay,
James,
Simon.
you go. No, James, go first.
But I think the blunt reality is that in Thailand and other particularly lower middle income countries, the new environment that we're going into, in which globalization is a less powerful force, is going to make it harder to develop economically. If you look at the really successful model of economic development pioneered in East Asia, which Thailand broadly follows, which was about investment in infrastructure, state capacity, and export-focused manufacturing, that was lifted along by an era of very rapid global trade and economic growth in the run-up to the financial crisis. We're now heading into a world in which the world is growing more slowly. Globalization is at best flatlining, potentially going into retreat. That makes the ideal development model pioneered in East Asia much more complicated. I would add a third factor that I think we haven't mentioned yet, which is a shame, which is obviously climate change. I think in 20 years' time, we'll not really remember the pandemic of COVID-19, but we're going to remember climate change. And climate in all sorts of ways is going to be the most powerful limiting force in the kind of globalization that we've seen, both in terms of travel and international trade and commerce, but also global value chains and the way in which they affect carbon. And the pandemic is going to have complicated effects on climate investment, climate mitigation, in all sorts of different ways. So I think the outlook there is potentially positive. It's possible to imagine out of this crisis and more generally a form of globalization which might be a bit slower, but a bit kinder, greener, and more egalitarian. But it's equally possible to imagine another path that is, in a sense, much more problematic with climate change, a particular problem. So I think there's a lot to think about there.
So when it comes to these two challenges of demography and the middle income trap, there's an interesting contrast between them. In the case of demography, we are probably able to identify what the solutions are even now. But those solutions are ones which are probably very hard to pull off politically and to maintain support for. So if you're worried about aging populations, one could think of solutions of training younger people better. Reforming schools and universities has always been traditionally very hard in most countries. And of course, the other big solution is immigration. Again, very sensitive. So with demography, we know what to do. We just don't know how to build the political support for it. In the case of the middle income trap, that's really about, one avoids that by nurturing and advancing a high quality innovation system. And here, there is very little in terms of agreement about how to do that. Okay, but yet I imagine that just about anything that was proposed is probably domestically, politically more palatable. So the problems are quite different in that finding support for building innovation systems probably not that hard. Knowing what to do is more difficult. And demography has the opposite problem. We know what to do, we just can't build the political support for it. And that, I think, differentiates these two particular problems. And these problems are not these challenges, by the way, that paradox is there in regions other than East Asia as well. So please don't feel that I'm singling out your region at all. I think we see these problems in North America and Western Europe as well. Thank you.
I suppose I'm the optimist of the group, or the most optimistic, let's say. I mean, there's a lot of focus on short-term things, political moves that are often not very smart, political conflict, short-term regulatory. There's a lot of this stuff that goes in and out month after month. The two things I keep my eyes on are the rising sort of middle class of Asia as a long-term secular trend, which I am incredibly optimistic about. I think, we didn't talk about Chinese consumers 10 years ago. They were not a significant economic force 10 years ago. Now they're a massive force. Well, where are they going to be in 10 years? So I think you can look at sort of the middle class of Asia. China's part of it, but not entirely. I would look at Southeast Asia and some other places. As you can bet on that 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be dramatically wealthier than it is today. That's a big trend I watch. The other one is digital transformation of various businesses, industries, way of living. I think we're in the early innings of something that's going to be very dramatic in its impact on the world. I don't think it's very easy to predict what the world's going to look like in 10 to 15 years. I think it's going to be dramatically different than it is today. So I'm comfortable looking at the wealth levels, and I think any business get ready to change, because we may be living through the most important sort of technological change we've ever seen. Maybe. I suspect that is the case, but we'll see how it plays out. So I'm very bullish on digital, and I'm very bullish on Asia across the board, with a lot of choppiness along the way.
So thank you very much for this very insightful, very exciting session. I see that it's already 3:23 p.m. in Thailand, so we're a little bit out of time. I would like to apologize again for the technical inconvenience at the very beginning, but my laptop crashed and turned off suddenly, so I had to move to my iPhone. And while this session was also a very good exercise, because I've been holding my iPhone for over an hour now, so I mean, I'm also grateful for this. So I would like to thank again our speaker today, Professor Evenett from the University of St. Gallen, Professor Jeffrey Towson from Peking University, Professor James Crabtree from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in US. And I'm very grateful because you shared with us, with our school, with our students, with our audience, very, very insightful, very, very crucial thoughts on the future of international trade, the future of globalization. So thank you again, and have a nice morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.